So by now you realize that ASL is a language, but I want you to clearly come to understand that ASL is a language just like other languages, just like spoken languages. First, let's take a look at the history of English, and then compare it to the history of ASL. Originally, there was a group of people who moved into the British Isles who spoke a language that's related to modern German. Now, they didn't speak German. They spoke languages called Angle and Saxon. And these were groups of people called the Angles and the Saxons. Their languages eventually combined together into something that would form English. But it wasn't a simple, straightforward process. It's not that the languages simply combined and that was English. There were invaders from the north called Vikings. They came and they brought with them a lot of new words, a lot of new terms, and even some grammatical features. That's right, there were grammatical structures that Angles and Saxons didn't have that Vikings brought. Many of the common words we use today actually came from the Vikings. But even more important than the invasions of the Vikings were the invasions of the French. The French went up into England, and when these French, they were from a particular area called Normandy, came up into English, they brought with them their language. In fact, they stayed so long that the French that they spoke had a huge impact on language. In fact, most of the words we use in formal settings come from Old French, because the French people who invaded became the kings and the nobles and the royalty. So the words that came from French were associated with being formal, whereas the words that were spoken by the Angles and the Saxons were the words spoken by the people who weren't royalty. They weren't the invaders. So even though the languages mix, we still sort of keep this separation between words that are French in origin, like enter and subjugate, versus the more common words like go in and take over. Enter and subjugate, they sound slightly more formal. Those are French based, whereas go in and take over, which mean basically the same thing, are less formal, and they happen to also have come from Anglo-Saxon languages. But that said, this complicated history, this complicated interaction between Angles, Saxons, Vikings, and French produced what we have today and what we know as English. Well, American Sign Language has a similar history. American Sign Language originally came from the colonial signs that were used by deaf people living in the United States. However, these signs were not widely standardized, and there were no schools for deaf people, so deaf people didn't have a chance to socialize and spread these signs. There were some sign systems that seem to have been used in the colonies, and there may have been some ability of different colonial deaf people to understand one another, but there was certainly no systematic, uniform way of signing. That all changed when Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet brought a Frenchman named Laurent Clerc to come and educate deaf people at what was then called the American Asylum for Deaf Mutes. I realize that's not a politically correct term today, but that eventually became the American School for the Deaf. He taught French Sign Language, and what resulted was this combination between colonial signs and French signs. And over time, that developed into what we now call ASL. In fact, a lot of the features of ASL that we have today are still based on this old French Sign Language. For instance, when you sign the sign for search or look for, you make a C hand shape. Well, that's because the French word chercher is the word for to look for. I'm probably pronouncing that French word terribly. I don't speak French. Another example, the word to see has a V hand shape. You probably thought it was just two representing the eyes, but it turns out it's actually from the French word to see, which starts with a V. But it wasn't only the initials of the words that came from French. It was also a large number of structures, grammatical components that didn't come from spoken French, but they came from French Sign Language. So this combination resulted in ASL. But we also can't forget that ASL is used along with English. That is, most deaf people who sign ASL read and write in English, and sometimes speak and listen to English, depending on their oral training and their use of their residual hearing. So English and ASL have been in contact for a long time, so we often have these phrases, these words, these grammatical structures that are borrowed from English into ASL, and that's okay. It's all right that there's been a complicated history. Now, after ASL developed in the 18th century, it wasn't originally recognized as a language. Of course, it was a slow process of development, of spreading, of standardization, just like it was with English, as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Vikings and the French speakers eventually developed a standardized language. With American Sign Language, it was well into the 60s, the 1960s, that it was just called sign. It wasn't called American Sign Language. It was just sign. People didn't use the term language. As a matter of fact, deaf people were even suspicious when a hearing man, a man named William Stokey, went to Gallaudet. And he was a linguist. He was there at Gallaudet University teaching English to deaf people. And he noticed that the system of signs that they used was complicated. It was intricate. It involved syntactic structures very different from English. And he said, you know what? This is a language. But deaf people didn't originally recognize it. They said no. They were suspicious. They said we do something different than language. It's our system. It's our shorthand. It's just our bad English. They were reluctant to call it American Sign Language. But eventually it did catch on, and it's continuing today to gain recognition as a language. Linguists now frequently study American Sign Language to understand how visual language works, to understand how language works in the brain, and maybe to even understand something about the origins of all language for humans. When thinking about ASL as a language, we also need to understand that this affects what we mean by ASL rules. We've already learned that when we talk about rules, we don't just mean sort of things that you can look up in a book. I mean, sure, once linguists are done doing their descriptive work, they can write a book that tells you the rules. Matter of fact, that's what we're doing in this class. We're going to describe what deaf people do, and we're going to then tell you those rules. But we have to understand that it's not as simple as sort of some made-up system, right? It's not like you can just make up the rules like you'd make up the rules of a game. No, they evolve naturally over time through this complex interplay. And as a result, the rules are complicated. It's not as simple as saying the time goes at the beginning of a sentence. Well, that's not always true. It's not as simple as saying you always sign time, topic, location, action, as some ASL teachers might have told you. Well, that might be a useful way of thinking about things, but it's more complicated than that. There are lots of factors that come into play. Just as in English, I might tell you that the subject comes before the verb, we can find examples of English sentences where the subject doesn't come before the verb. So it is true in ASL that we can find examples of sentences where the time doesn't come at the beginning of the sentence, or whatever other simple rule you think you've learned has an exception. This is in part because ASL is still changing. It's continuing to evolve. It's continuing to be influenced by English, and as it evolves, as it's influenced by English, these rules are going to change. Remember, these are mental rules. The only way to know what is acceptable in ASL is to look at what lots of deaf people do. Native deaf signers, to figure out what they sign, to ask them how they sign it. And that's what the rules of ASL are. It's not as simple as looking at your ASL 1 book, because those rules are often not representative of the complexity, the naturally evolving and the changing mental rules that we find within the minds of native ASL signers.